Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker of the day, Luiz Pessoa, from the University of Maryland, College Park. So Luiz started out in computer science in the University of Rio de Janeiro, and he also got his MSc in computer engineering there. But then he decided to get into computational neuroscience, and he went to Boston University to study in the group of Steve Grossberg. And that's where I was too. Actually, I was a couple of years after him, so he was sort of the upperclassman to whom I was always looking up to, and I still do. And he got his PhD there in 1995. After that, he returned to Brazil for a few years, back to the computer science. And then took a visiting fellow position at NIH to work with Leslie Ungerleider. And then finally went to Brown University, and then finally to, he then got a faculty position at Brown University in 2003, then moved to Indiana, and then finally was associate professor. He is now at the, since 2010, at the University of Maryland, College Park. And his research is, combines really empirical and computational work. And he's particularly well known for promoting a view of the brain that addresses the actual interactions between things like cognition, emotion, and motivation. And like many people, unlike many people who study these things in isolation, he looks at them together. And I think that's what he's going to talk about. He's written recently a book about this, and I think he's going to describe some of this. His title is The Brain as a Distributed Entangled System. So please join me in welcoming Luiz Pessoa.
Thank you so much, Paul. Is this on? No, right? It is? Okay, great. All right. So Paul asked me to leave 5 minutes. You have to time it. 5 minutes. Is it on now? Yeah, now it is on. Sorry. I guess I did. Okay, so since we're in an AI conference, I just have a few slides on something that is related to AI. So how about we start with the idea of trying to do an architecture, a robot architecture at that has both cognitive and emotional components. One possibility is that we start with, as AI seems to have started, thinking a lot about cognition and putting a module or a system for cognition and having an add-on module that does something that we can call emotion. And hopefully we have some kind of top-down control over this, which would be really important in a robot. So how does this work? How would it work? The way it works is that we would put a lot of effort in trying to understand and make some kind of very fancy, interesting, sophisticated AI model or computational model, more generally speaking, that would be serving as the cognitive component of this architecture. And perhaps a little bit as an afterthought, we would think of something that gives some flavor of emotion, perhaps by adding something related to valence, positive, negative, that can lead to assessment of what these the events are, positive, negative events, and if you kind of integrate them in some way, that leads to something that could be understood as feelings, and maybe some kind of more long-lasting mood, and so on and so forth. In this type of architecture, we think of something like emotion as an add-on so that the robot has some emotion. Okay, that's fine. How does it happen in the brain, however? So that's what I want to do today and discuss with you some of my views of how we can think of it, some ways to think about this in a biological context. So this is not artificial intelligence, is natural intelligence. So for that, we have to understand how the brain is organized and how the brain actually supports complex functions and mental states, and how are those instantiated? What is the brain in the first place? So if we step back and take the most macro view of what the brain is, according to neuroscience, it can be thought of, let's say, something that contains 50 to 100, 200 cortical areas, plus, again, subcortical areas and areas all the way going down to midbrain and hindbrain. What are our areas? Areas can be thought of as being distinguished by their structural composition, arrangement, which gives us a clue that these differences in structure lead to differences in function. So this is a very old idea, something that led, for instance, Brodmann himself, the anatomist that created the Brodmann map that is used to this day, to parcel the brain into regions that have different structural and consequently different functional arrangements, functions, have different functional, they instantiate different functions. So the bottom line here is that the functional units of the cortex then, and by extension subcortical areas, become these areas themselves. So we can point somewhere to the brain and say, okay, this is actually structurally different, this is area 19, so this has some function that is different from the adjacent areas that are structurally different, right? So this area here behaves a little differently from, oh, actually it's area 18, sorry, that is different from area 17. What are our areas? Obviously, given that have been living since at least the 1950s with a strong computational frame of mind, if you will, or framework that frames so much of how we think, it is very natural of thinking of areas as entities that implement some kind of input-output mapping that can be summarized, specified, formalized in terms of some function. So with these ideas in mind, how do we study the brain? One way to study the brain then would be to try to decompose the brain in a strategy very commonly used in engineering and computer science, in a divide and conquer strategy, such that we would try to understand it by decomposing it into individual parts, very much like we would understand some kind of complex Swiss watch here with perhaps a few hundred parts that work together. So what we would do, we would have this first region here, we go and map out what it does, perhaps we lesion it, perhaps we measure it, silence it, do all sorts of things, and we understand what it does. Likewise, for the second region, and we keep on doing this over and over and over again until our job is done and we know how the brain works, right? So the brain works under this view as a collection of parts whose summed functions evoke or support the behaviors that we're interested in. This view has lots of implications, one of which maybe we can discuss in the question period, that it also has a very important way of thinking of causation in the brain, is very much in a way that is summarized by these Rube Goldberg apparatus type of schemas, in which to have this light here, by pulling on this cord here by this hand, it essentially amounts to a sequence of steps that sequentially trigger the subsequent steps all the way in a complex chain, such that eventually a cause leads to an effect. So some kind of sequential Newtonian sort of one domino piece hitting the other and leading to the eventual effect. So is this view defensible? Is this how we should be studying the brain? And I would claim that this view is indeed defensible if the brain turns out to be a system that is nearly decomposable, or a near decomposable system. And this is an idea that comes from the 60s, from Herbert Simon. Several people have, I think at least Paul mentioned him, but Herbert Simon was one proponent of one way of understanding complex systems is literally by focusing on the problems that exist in nature that happen to be near decomposable. Near complete decomposability allows us to investigate systems that are highly complicated, one piece at a time. What kind of system is the brain? If we think of a spectrum from something that is strongly decomposable, perhaps an engineered system that we engineered to be so, to maybe some imaginary object that we hypothesize being highly non-decomposable, there is a whole spectrum. So the question is, where does the actual human brain or biological brains fall in this spectrum? So I would like to claim today that the brain is actually something that lies on an end of this spectrum that is highly non-decomposable. And to motivate this, I will suggest a few principles of organization of the brain, starting with the first one, which I call massive combinatorial anatomical connectivity. So this principle acknowledges the fact that if we look at the entire literature that we have generated in the past few decades on anatomical pathways that exist in the brain and have been documented, that both cortical and subcortical brain regions are very densely interconnected. So this is exemplified by the study by Modi Singh here from 2010, in which they took hundreds of anatomical studies and collated all of the anatomical pathways that were reported in these papers, and actually made a big graph analysis to understand how information could flow from one sector of the brain, the temporal cortex, all the way to some other part of the brain, the frontal cortex. So this is one illustration, is not the one study that suggests this. This is the outcome of a broad literature that is summarized, I think, or exemplified by this study. So this is, I think, fair to say that is a well-established property of brain anatomical organization. And this anatomical organization is sometimes acknowledged by neuroscientists and even AI people. Terry Sosnowski was talking about basal ganglia today. And there are these massive connectional systems that link not just adjacent parts, but literally, for instance, span cortical, subcortical, thalamic, cortical circuits in complex anatomical arrangements. So everyone who takes a class in a course in neuroscience, in systems neuroscience at least, will learn about these loops, but perhaps they will not be aware that this is it's but one of the many examples that exist that really demonstrate the presence of these massive, large-scale connectional systems. And these include many things such as amygdala systems, thalamus, hypothalamus, cerebellum, and so on and so forth. Some of them I actually have studied quite a bit, for instance, like the amygdala. So it's the important point here is that it's not exclusively, there's no just one example that suggests the connection to be of this nature, but there are really many of these kinds of connectional systems. But I want to shift now from anatomy to function and highlight the fact that we should be thinking of brain and brain function in terms of these highly distributed functional, in terms of this highly distributed functional coordination, or these interactions. These interactions that can be exemplified by considering pairs of regions and looking at the relationship between their signals. We had just a talk on functional connectivity established by Pearson correlation, or you can use range of causality, mutual information, you can use all sorts of things. But I want to highlight that this example here and the approach that is typically taken being pairwise, a couple of regions, and looking at how their signals are interrelated, irrespective of there being an anatomical connection linking them directly or not. So independent of that, their signals can be related. After all, it's just a mathematical operation. But this example here just looks at pairwise relationships, but there's nothing that prevents us from looking at the covariation, the higher order covariation of signals across multiple regions or multiple parts of the brain simultaneously. So what we're interested then, according to this principle, is that we should move away from thinking about anatomical localization to understanding functional relationships of a given region to all possible regions, or at least a subset of other regions. So this principle can be stated as the fact that we observe this highly distributed functional interactions and coordinated across the brain that can be then, requires then us to develop techniques to map out this sort of vast space of functional relationships or interactions that exist across regions. If we extend these two, or if we think of both the anatomical and the functional principles, one of the consequences of putting them together, I would claim, is that it leads us to the view that the unit of processing that we should be interested in is not at the level of brain region, whatever exactly that would mean, which is a concept that is constantly debated, but is really the circuits or networks that should be considered the functional units of the brain. So what these units should be thought of as doing or supporting is that they support the collective processing, that they instantiate or they represent the collective processing across multiple regions that are dynamically recruited into multi-region assemblies to support the behavioral needs of the animal, the human, in a given behavioral context. Okay, so what kinds of networks? So I'm saying that the important thing is these circuits. The circuits are the unit of interest. They should be the unit of interest if we're trying to understand the brain, the biological brain. So what kinds of circuits, what kinds of networks? Here I'm using circuits and networks interchangeably. So what I would like to claim in the next few 2 to 3 minutes is that we should be thinking of them as instantiating, implementing, carrying out properties, system-level properties, collective properties that are not easily accessible or even possibly predictable in some cases from the behavior of the individual regions alone. So what we are interested in is having an understanding of multi-region functions, a function of regions 1, 2 through n, and my claim is then that that's poorly characterized by considering the regions that neurosciences often ascribe to individual regions. The function of region 1 is f of R1, you specify what it is to compute edges, is to compute motion signals, is to do something in motor control and planning and so on and so forth. If we if this suggestion that I'm making, the suggestion that I'm making should be we're going to expand on it, but it should be it's useful to highlight, contrast it with what we would expect in a near decomposable system, right? In a near decomposable system, a lesion of a given region causes a deficit to the network in which it belongs, that is directly related to the putative function of that region. So it goes against what I was saying, that the collective properties of the circuit are extremely difficult to guess or work out based on the functions of the individual regions. The claim then is that in an interactionally complex system like biological brains, this is not the outcome. A given region's lesion does not cause a deficit that is easily ascribable to a function that is observed at the region level in isolation from the system. So what kinds of networks are there? One type of network that we can think of is a simple circuit or network that has brain regions that, let's suppose for the moment, following a tradition in neuroscience of more than a century, that individual regions compute fairly specific functions. So region 1 implements F1, region 2 implements F2, and so on. So the claim then at the circuit level that I'm making is where I deviate from most neuroscientists, is that the network function, that is the function that is instantiated by R1, 2, 3, and 4, is a property, is a function that is poorly approximated by considering a function, considering the individual functions that are worked out by considering what individual regions alone are doing. So the function is poorly approximated by individual parts. But what do we exactly mean by poorly approximated? Is the idea that these functions are novel and difficult to predict and possibly irreducible to the primitive functions that are putatively ascribed to these individual regions. So knowing the regions themselves will not be something that will be sufficient to work out the system level collective function of the circuit. A second type of network that I would like to suggest we should consider is what I call type 2 networks. A network is a little bit more controversial in neuroscience because I would claim that in these kinds of networks we shouldn't consider that even the regions themselves instantiate well-defined primitives, because the well-defined functional primitives are actually something that themselves depend on, in many cases, could depend on, for instance, a pair of regions here like region 1 and region 2 or region 1 and region 3. Right, so in addition to a fourth region that itself perhaps carries out a reasonable primitive or a function that is well specified by the region itself. So what I'm claiming here is that this is just another way of saying that what we should be seeing or we should be proposing or considering is the fact that the basic functions of interest are inherently distributed across regions. So perhaps to this crowd that's not very controversial. So likewise, like the case before, what we had is that these functions of the circuit are poorly approximated by the functions even now of this combined function 1 here that requires 2 regions, and this function 2 that requires 2 regions, including a common region, and this fourth region. An example in neuroscience is more controversial, but in this room is really trivial because we are all familiar and like neural networks. So they have sort of undifferentiated, or they have by definition undifferentiated, most of them at least, undifferentiated units that when trained together will evoke functions of interest that don't map or don't necessarily map directly to the individual atomic function of the individual nodes. So in this sense, the function of the system or the neural network is sort of difficult to map back or novel with respect to what the individual units are doing. So just very briefly here, since this is a neuroscience presentation, neuroscience talk, I just want to give you an example of a case. Again, each study is not going to be definitive, but a line of studies that is slowly providing evidence in this direction, and it's accumulating. And I'm just going to give you one example. So this example is a study in which they were trying to understand how persistent motor activity, something like a motor working memory, how does this circuit work? And one of the ideas is that requires multiple brain regions. And in monkeys, the idea is that it would require 2 regions that were known to be important for working memory, for this persistent motor activity, maintaining the plan to make a saccade after an interval, for instance, to a direction that was indicated during the cue period of a working memory task. And what the authors propose, Hart and Hook propose, is that, in fact, if you do computational modeling on these data, the suggestion is that a circuit involving both the parietal cortex area LIP and the frontal cortex area frontal eye field jointly instantiate this computation of maintaining this trace of this preparatory motor command or activity. So the point here is that one cannot simply point to a brain region and say this is where working memory is taking place. It is really something that is effectively distributed across regions. And there are several other examples. We can talk about it later if you want. Okay, so in this last part, this last segment of the talk, I want to shift back to the robot that we talked about in the beginning and see how a few things work out with these kinds of ideas. What are their implications? So emotion in the brain is an area that I have studied for a couple of decades, and how it interacts with cognition and so on. So let's just discuss a little bit about emotion, which is obviously underrepresented here because emotion is not really at the core of what AI is at the moment. It's something that it has to do much more with so-called cognitive processes, which I think cognitive and emotional processes are intertwined, but that's a little bit of a different story. So historically, emotion has been thought in the past century and a half as involving a separate circuit. So for instance, in the late 40s, there was the proposal of a limbic system, or so-called visceral system, which is an antiquated, inadequate concept, by the way, that is really not supported by modern day data. But nonetheless, that's how it started with well, at the time we arrived at, in the late 40s, at the idea that there was a system that was responsible and dedicated to emotion. If we fast forward to today, what we see is that this has shifted, but nonetheless, that has changed the areas involved in exactly the composition. But again, there's the idea there are some key brain regions, including the famous or infamous amygdala, the orbitofrontal cortex, anterior insula, several brain regions that may not necessarily be of your interest, but the idea being that they compose the emotional brain, if you will. And even more so, there's the idea that within this dedicated circuit to emotion, there are really structures that really do the heavy lifting here. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, for instance, the idea was that the hypothalamus was really the center of the emotional brain. In the past 30 years or so, that has been shifted to the amygdala, another subcortical region in the medial temporal lobe. But I would like to claim, related to the points that I was making about massive anatomical connectivity, that if we pay attention to the connectivity, it is really not reasonable to think, for instance, as the amygdala as a center that is isolated and implementing emotion in the context of having massive connectivity to both cortex and subcortical regions. So it's not something that would work well as a module in computer science, because you would not want this module being talking to everything and receiving signals from everyone. That would be sort of like a really strange kind of solution. So it kind of suggested something else is going on. This notion of the massive interconnectivity between brain regions and leading to this interactional complexity anatomically, leading to this highly distributed functional connectivity and circuit-wide system-level units. Let me give you a brief example of how this has important implications about what we think about the brain and to studying the brain. An important phenomenon that is studied in neuroscience is called fear extinction. So if I go into a Pavlovian classical conditioning paradigm and I learn to associate a tone with shock, I will start reacting to the tone and fearing the tone. And the process of fear extinction is what allows me to learn or to unlearn that relationship, or better still, learn a new relationship that now this tone is safe. Why? Because it is now presented multiple times without the shock. So animals are adaptive and they learn that. In a few trials, they start treating the tone in a way that is not evoking fear. So that's the phenomenon of fear extinction. So as you can imagine, this is actually something that is of vast importance, and it's used, for instance, in the clinical psychological literature that how do I extinguish some phobia that I might have to snakes, to spiders, or how I have anxiety of flying, and I extinguish these fears. Okay, so in the early 90s, there was a proposal that was very important by Joe Ledoux and his colleagues, given their anatomical findings, that we could think of fear extinction in the following way. There is a circuit in the brain such that the basolateral amygdala, which is one component of the amygdala, which is important, the basolateral amygdala interacts heavily with the medial prefrontal cortex. It's a part of the frontal cortex in the middle, and the hippocampus. Well, hippocampus is important for navigation and context and so on, in a relatively simple manner. It's sort of like these cognitive components here in the medial prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. Well, I should say, the medial prefrontal cortex thought of as sort of like a cognitive top-down inhibition of emotion, very much like this schema that I showed, the picture that I showed in the robot in the first slide, so that when I learn that the tone is not evoking, paired with a shock anymore, then my medial prefrontal cortex inhibits my amygdala and I'm not fearful anymore. So that was an idea that made a lot of sense at the time, and the anatomy seemed to confirm that, and some experimental findings seem to be consistent with that. But if we fast forward to a few decades later, to 20, 25 years later, what we found out is that this circuit that was so clean and textbook-like, if you will, actually turns out to be tremendously much more complicated. What we find is that the connectivity that was outlined to be exactly like this turns out to be completely different, or to be substantially different, I should say. For instance, the connections between the medial prefrontal cortex and the basolateral amygdala are actually bidirectional. They're bidirectional, so they go from one to the other and from the amygdala back to the medial prefrontal cortex. Likewise with the hippocampus. So they're interacting in a circuit that it has a lot more potential for complexity, functionally speaking. And not only that, but this system, as it was studied, had to be gradually expanded. Publication after publication after publication, literature has accumulated in a way that now we view this system as minimally containing many other players that are themselves interacting bidirectionally with some complex loops that exist that interlink them. So even working out the causal flow of the function of the signals in this system turns out to be a major challenge. The claim that I would like to make for us in neuroscience, and perhaps this can be generalized to some architectures in AI, is that by only considering these simple ways of decomposing systems as if they were, by definition, nearly decomposable systems, will prove to be really insufficient to understanding more complex behaviors and ways in which these regions participate in large-scale circuits that they are the ones that support complex behaviors such as fear extinction. So I think that this leads to a picture of simplicity that doesn't map very well to what we see once we study a phenomenon at greater depth. Okay, so let me just try to now shift to a last part of the talk and have like a even broader overview of the kinds of things that I'm trying to convey here today. So at the broadest level, how do we study the brain? So if we take a popular and very good textbook, such as this one, Cognitive Neuroscience, what we will find is a series of chapters, one on perception, one on attention, memory and learning, language, and so on and so forth, executive functions. This is basically cognition. And what we try to do is to find some kind of simple mapping between these domains, these mental domains, and the brain, in a way that they partition the brain in some kind of almost disjoint fashion, right? So Perception is somewhere around here. Attention has to do with something here and here. Cognition is obviously, as we know, prefrontal cortex. There's no question about that. I'm just kidding. So we want to work out these mappings, right? When we do this in neuroscience, typically, we followed an approach of using these standard mental terms, perception, emotion, cognition, as if they were sufficiently well defined so that we could actually try to carve the brain in this way in a meaningful fashion. And what I'd like to claim is that there's a tiny bit of truth to that, or a small amount of truth to that, but I claim that is largely insufficient for us to understand actual complex behaviors. Because what this type of approach does is it creates a language that we use in science that really emphasizes the independence and separation of mental domains and of brain components. So the claim that I'm trying to make in the argument that I was making about those principles of organization of the brain, and something that I work out in a lot of detail in this book that I wrote called The Entangled Brain. And I'm not advertising because it's not considered advertising if it's open access. So it's at MIT Press, open access, so it's free. You can just click and you get the PDF file. So what I would like to argue is that we really need to shift somehow. I don't have a solution for this. We need to find languages, or a language that emphasizes interaction in the interaction and the integration that is really needed to consider these large-scale systems, which are the ones that I would claim support these behaviors that are really complex or interesting, that we actually are doing neuroscience, not to understand a minimal behavior in the lab, but something that hopefully informs the behaviors that we really care about. So, when we think about the brain, it's very natural, and it has been natural for the past 150 years, to think of it as involving some form of centralized processing. These centralized processes carry out functions that one example or illustration is the one that is repeatedly used in the literature, in every book, in every textbook or popular general audience book, that the prefrontal cortex really is something that is the apex of some kind of integration that controls behavior. So it's a master controller. Or for instance, for those of you who might be interested in emotion, the hypothalamus is considered a controller of the autonomic nervous system. So literally a controller in the strict sense of the word. What I would like to suggest is that we should really consider other kinds of architectures, and hopefully this may inspire one or two people in the more AI direction, that we should be thinking in terms of organizations that are inherently distributed, and without a strict, even more so, without a strict hierarchical organization. So the architectures in which the flow of information is not from, let's say, a periphery to a prefrontal cortex, but it's multi-way, bidirectional, in fact, multi-directional, that defies a hierarchical definition or an understanding. And so it's one word that is often used, is that it's an hierarchical organization. Sometimes I say this and I talk about the entangled brain, and people think about, oh, okay, now everything talks to everything, everything does everything. That is not what I mean. What I mean is that we need to consider these kinds of hierarchical architectures in the presence, considering the fact that we know that there is a very well-defined and structured, but highly interconnected anatomical backbone. So I'm not saying that everything talks to everything, everything does everything. So these circuits, these distributed circuits, what I would like to propose is that they assemble in a way that spans the entire neural axis, all the way from the glorified, the major, most loved part of the brain, the cortex, to the most lowly, poor subcortex in the hindbrain. And these circuits assemble in a way that several people have emphasized today, in a way that is dynamic. It's all dynamic, right? So it's not something that it's something that is assembled dynamically according to the state or the context, the behavioral demands and context that the animal has at a given time. Here the animal is just is just grazing, let's say, doing something that is not being challenged or anything, and here it hears some noise and it's alert, trying to monitor what is out in my field, and the next step might be running away. So this whole assembling of these circuits is not something that follows anatomical, it doesn't follow, like the talk we just heard, in a simple, straightforward way from the anatomical connectivity. Is something that is highly context dependent, which is sort of easy to implement in these biological brains with these massive amounts of connectivity. Okay, so just in the last minute before I finish, so that we can have a few questions, I'd like to discuss a couple of implications for brain function when we consider them. One of them, just very briefly, is the fact that we need to then shift from studying brain regions to investigating coordinated cross-brain activity. Right, so for instance, in a recent paper by the Brody lab, they were interested in understanding, for instance, the moment-to-moment co-fluctuations across many brain regions that happened to be aligned to a neural state space that predicted behavioral choice. But the important thing was that this was done in a brain-wide fashion, trying to understand how these signals were either synergistically, they were instantiated in a way that was relatively segregated or separated, or they were combining synergistically and so on. That's an empirical question for a given problem of interest. But the one that I would like to suggest, just to leave you off here in the last 30 seconds, is that one of the things that happens in neuroscience is that every time people seem to be enormously surprised by some function of some lowly region in the brain, typically regions that are subcortical or brainstem areas. For instance, this paper here was thought to be really surprising to a lot of people because the superior colliculus, a region in the midbrain, oops, sorry, I need to stop in 30 seconds. This region actually was shown to support higher cognitive function. And people were like amazed, like how can a region in the midbrain actually respond in a way that seems to be sensitive to categories, and actually complex categories? That doesn't make sense. And a region that I study a lot, for instance, is another region in the midbrain, the periaqueductal gray, which is thought to be really important for emotion-related behaviors, emotional behaviors, motivational behaviors, including, for instance, if an animal detects a threat, they freeze in place and they keep in this frozen position for a while so that they can avert the predator spotting them and so on. So, but it's literally seen as a descending system that essentially just is an outflow. And what I would like to propose is that, and I discuss in detail in other places, is that this region, the periaqueductal gray, has much more interesting, many more interesting functions, because it actually is part of loops that loop back, in fact, all the way to cortex, and in fact, throughout the subcortex via the thalamus, creating dynamically generated circuits that can meet the behavioral demands that the animal has to face at a given time. So I'm going to stop here so that we can have a few questions. Thank you very much. So I had 45 minutes. I should have.
Well, I'll ask one that's maybe some people are thinking. You know, what you're doing now is you're essentially telling people that one of the things that we try to do in neuro AI is get AI people to benefit more from neuroscience knowledge. But you're making that really hard now, because you're saying that it's just interconnected in so many ways. What can we get out of it that actually structures our knowledge enough to be able to make a model of it? That's
a great question.
Where do you go from here? If you
Yeah, so for instance, I'm not an AI person, so excuse my ignorance, but for instance, from what I see, there's interest in creating some architectures, some AI architectures that have some subsystems, right? Some subsystems and that would combine into a much larger overall system. So what I would suggest is that we can use these kinds of principles to conceptualize them much more in an integrated fashion than something that really isolates the subcomponents of whatever architecture you're considering. So you're considering an architecture that has something about perception, about action, about cognition. And even cognition could be a memory module or some other module, planning or language and so on. And so the tendency that we would have in computer science and in AI, I think, is to isolate and modularize things. And what I would claim is that for intelligent behavior, we need the communication between these modules, if you will, in ways that I think are underappreciated in even in neuroscience and even in psychology, that they still talk about perception as something that is encapsulated from cognition. Yeah, so that's would be my short answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Luis. Fantastic talk. Yeah, I'm often annoyed by people who say, I have 3 questions and 5 comments, but I'm going to do that, right? I have 1 question and 1 comment. So my comment is, I think, so some people would claim that when you go up closer to higher order cognitive tasks, then the notion of network becomes potentially even more crucial. And if it's more primary responses, pure, and I think what I'm taking home from your message is that that probably should be reconsidered, because there's nothing really as in our brain as just a very simple low-level visual task, because it turns out even in simple visual search tasks, in many cases, prefrontal cortex is also involved. And so would you agree generally that it's important across the board? There's no distinction between higher order and lower order cognition?
Yeah, it's really across the board. So something that I worked for quite some time, I worked for quite some time, was the influence of both reward and negative affective content of information and how it shapes visual perception and how that actually influences visual processing itself. So the amygdala, for instance, is known to have substantial projections across the entirety of early visual cortex, even all the way to V1. So I don't think, for instance, there's anything about vision that is neutral. Vision is always embedded in meaning.
Right.
And in fact, we have systems that support that anatomically and functionally.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was my comment. So my question now, and this relates to, we had Michael Graziano at Maine, I think 2022, and we had a discussion about consciousness and about the notion of, one of the things he was saying is that maybe we should give the term or the notion consciousness a break, because it's ill-defined, and we just spend half of the debates talking about, please define what you mean by consciousness, and we're not moving forward. And so we rarely have experts on emotion in our meetings, so I'm super happy that you're here, and I'd like to hear from you as an expert, what do you think about people that would say, emotion is also maybe a fuzzy and maybe ill-defined. Is it for you something that is very clearly defined? And specifically, if you want to afterwards say, okay, emotion in machines, we know how to do that because we understand emotions, or would you say emotion is maybe as fuzzy as consciousness and we should break it down and no?
Well, I wouldn't say as fuzzy as consciousness, because that's probably the apex of fuzziness. But I do think that we like to behave as if some of these mental domains, for instance, motivation, a lot of people separate completely motivation from emotion and from cognition. I think these are completely ill-defined, and we do ourselves a disservice in trying to draw sharper boundaries. If you want to have an approach to language and science in which you use words but you view them very malleably, it's fine with me. But I think it can be confusing unless we make it clear that when we talk about emotion is something that does not draw a sharp boundary with everything else. So bottom line is that I do think that these terms are largely problematic. They came from literally 150 years ago, from when we knew a lot less about psychology and a lot less about how our mental states and behaviors are mapped into this hardware that we have. And if there's some truth to the fact that it might be entangled anatomically and functionally, to have these mental states be pure emotion or pure cognition seems to me unwarranted.
Okay, because there's nobody behind me, if I can, Paul, very quickly. Emotions and machines, what's your take on this? Some people say, well, we talk about different forms of intelligence, we talk about emotional intelligence, we talk about maybe group intelligence, we talk about, what is your take on trying to find ways how we can maybe embed emotions into machines, AI with emotions? Is that a good thing, is that a bad thing? What do you think?
Yeah, I've changed my mind, but let me start. A few years ago, I wrote a few papers about having emotion and considering, so I wrote a few papers on if you want to have intelligent, autonomous agents, you need to have motivation and behavior in their architecture. And I wrote a few things, and nowadays I just don't say anything more about that because that would be a disaster. Because I was interested in the relationship in the abstract sense. But now, given the last 10 years of AI, the last thing that we want is to, I think, to put goals like the ethics committee was, the panel, sorry, the committee, the ethics panel was discussing, having goals and having to have feelings because you have, I can cut myself here right now and I have a very strong reaction to it and so on because of survival and so on. I think that would be a disaster for our future. So I just stopped completely talking about that. And I used to talk about it because I cannot, my view, but I cannot agree with an idea that cognition can be understood, at least human-like cognition, without understanding autonomy and agency that directly necessitate motivation and emotion, in my view, to be integrated into cognition. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I'll catch you later.
So please thank me. And